Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that feels both familiar and utterly foreign. A world of grand ceremonies, ancient traditions, and social rituals that shaped entire societies. We're talking about weddings in medieval times, but we're not stopping there. We'll explore the intricate customs, the surprising realities, the economic transactions, the religious significance, and the everyday lives of people who participated in these elaborate celebrations. From peasant unions in small village churches to royal spectacles that involved entire kingdoms, we'll uncover what it really meant to get married during the Middle Ages. We'll also venture beyond the wedding day itself to understand courtship, marriage laws, the role of women, the influence of the church, and how these medieval practices have echoed through the centuries to influence even modern weddings today. So if you've ever wondered what it was truly like to witness or participate in a medieval wedding ceremony, or how people fell in love, negotiated marriages, and built families in an era so different from our own, then you're in exactly the right place. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. To understand medieval weddings, we first need to understand the medieval world itself, because weddings weren't just personal celebrations. They were social, economic, and political events that held immense significance for families, communities, and even nations. The medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th century to the late 15th century, was a time of feudalism, rigid social hierarchies, and powerful religious institutions. The Catholic Church held enormous influence over daily life, including the most intimate aspects of human relationships. Marriage was considered a sacrament, a holy union ordained by God, and the Church had very specific rules about who could marry whom, when marriages could take place, and how they should be conducted. But beyond the religious aspects, marriages were also practical arrangements. For nobility, they were strategic alliances that could secure peace between warring families, expand territories, or strengthen political power. For common people, marriages were economic partnerships necessary for survival, combining resources, labor, and land. Love, as we think of it today, was rarely the primary consideration, though that doesn't mean affection didn't develop between spouses over time. The medieval world viewed marriage through a lens that balanced divine law, social necessity, and family obligation, creating a complex tapestry of customs and expectations that varied across regions, social classes, and centuries. The structure of medieval society was fundamentally hierarchical, with clear divisions between different classes that affected every aspect of life, including marriage. At the top were kings and queens, whose marriages were matters of international diplomacy and could change the course of history. Below them were the various ranks of nobility, from dukes and earls down to knights and minor landholders. Each level of nobility had different marriage customs and constraints, though all shared the common feature that marriages were primarily about maintaining and expanding power, land, and influence. The nobility comprised only a small percentage of medieval society, perhaps 5 to 10% depending on the region and time period. The vast majority of medieval people were peasants who worked the land either as serfs bound to their lord's estate or as free peasants who owned or rented their own small plots. Between the nobility and peasantry was a growing middle class of merchants, craftsmen, and townspeople, particularly in the later medieval period as towns and commerce expanded. This middle class developed its own marriage customs that blended elements of noble practice with the more practical concerns of common people. Understanding these social divisions is crucial to understanding medieval marriage, because the experience of marriage varied enormously depending on where you fell in this hierarchy. A royal wedding was a spectacular public event involving thousands of people and immense political implications, while a peasant wedding might involve only the local village community and be primarily concerned with combining two small farms or households. The concept of courtship in medieval times was vastly different from modern dating. For the nobility, courtship was often a formalized process involving negotiations between families rather than romantic encounters between potential spouses. Young nobles might not even meet their future partners until shortly before the wedding, as matches were arranged by parents, guardians, or even monarchs based on political and economic considerations. However, the tradition of courtly love, which flourished particularly during the High Middle Ages, introduced a romanticized ideal of love that existed somewhat separately from marriage. Courtly love was often expressed through poetry, music, and elaborate gestures, typically involving a knight devoted to a noble lady, often someone else's wife. This idealized love was meant to be pure and unconsummated, serving more as an artistic and social convention than a practical path to marriage. The rules of courtly love were complex and somewhat paradoxical. The lover was supposed to worship his lady from afar, perform brave deeds in her honor, write poetry celebrating her virtues, and remain devoted even if she never reciprocated his feelings. This tradition produced some of the most beautiful poetry and literature of the medieval period, including the works of troubadours in southern France and minnesingers in Germany. Yet this romantic ideal existed in tension with the practical realities of arranged marriages, creating a cultural contradiction where people celebrated romantic love in art while accepting arranged marriages in life. For common people, courtship was more straightforward but still governed by social norms and community oversight. Young people might meet at church, festivals, markets, or while working in fields. They would interact under the watchful eyes of family members and neighbors, as reputation was crucial, especially for young women. A woman's virtue was her most valuable asset in the marriage market, and any hint of impropriety could damage her prospects significantly. Men typically needed to establish themselves with a trade or land before they could marry, which often meant waiting until their mid-20s or later. The courtship process involved gaining approval from both sets of parents, and while young people might express preferences, parental consent was usually required, particularly for those under the age of majority. Young men might signal their interest in a young woman through small gestures, offering to help her family with work, giving small gifts, or finding excuses to talk with her after church services. Young women had to be more circumspect in showing interest, as being too forward could damage their reputations. The community watched courtship with interest, and neighbors would often have opinions about whether a particular match was suitable. In villages where everyone knew everyone else, there were few secrets, and young people courting knew their behavior was being observed and discussed. This community involvement could be constraining, but it also provided guidance and protection, as the community had a stake in ensuring that marriages were suitable and that young people weren't being exploited or making foolish choices. The betrothal, or engagement, was an extremely important step in the medieval marriage process, often considered as binding as marriage itself. A betrothal was essentially a contract, sometimes written but often verbal, made before witnesses in which a couple promised to marry each other at a future date. This promise was taken very seriously under both civil and canon law. Breaking a betrothal could result in legal consequences, including financial penalties or forced marriage. The betrothal often involved the exchange of gifts, particularly rings, which symbolized the binding nature of the promise. These betrothal rings might be simple bands for common folk or elaborate jeweled pieces for the wealthy. The period between betrothal and marriage could last months or even years, depending on circumstances such as the need to accumulate resources, complete apprenticeships, or wait for favorable political conditions in the case of noble marriages. During this time, the betrothed couple was expected to remain chaste, though they might be allowed more freedom to interact than before their betrothal. The Church eventually formalized betrothal practices, distinguishing between sponsalia per verba de presenti, which was a present-tense promise that constituted an actual marriage, and sponsalia per verba de futuro, which was a future-tense promise to marry that could be dissolved under certain circumstances. This distinction became important in legal disputes about whether a valid marriage existed. The legal and social significance of betrothal meant that families took these agreements extremely seriously. Once a betrothal was contracted, both families began preparing for the wedding and the establishment of the new household. For peasant families, this might mean the groom's family building or preparing a cottage for the couple, while the bride's family accumulated household goods and provisions. For noble families, betrothal initiated complex legal negotiations about property settlements, dowries, and the terms under which the marriage would occur. Betrothal ceremonies themselves could be quite formal among the nobility, with witnesses, written contracts, and sometimes even celebrations that resembled smaller versions of wedding feasts. The exchange of betrothal gifts wasn't merely symbolic. These gifts had legal significance and could be used as evidence that a betrothal had occurred if disputes arose later. Breaking a betrothal was not undertaken lightly and could result in lawsuits, demands for return of gifts, and damaged reputations for both families involved. In some cases, if one party broke the betrothal without good cause, they might be required to compensate the other party financially for the breach of contract. The binding nature of betrothal meant that young people and their families needed to be certain about the match before entering into the betrothal agreement, as backing out later would be difficult and costly. Medieval marriage law was a complicated mix of church canon law, local customs, and secular regulations that varied significantly across different regions and time periods. The Church gradually established its authority over marriage during the medieval period, culminating in marriage being officially declared a sacrament at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Before this consolidation of church authority, marriage practices were often governed by local traditions and secular law. The Church established several requirements for valid marriages, including free consent from both parties, which was theoretically revolutionary, since it meant that even a peasant girl could refuse a marriage her parents arranged, though in practice, social pressure often overrode this principle. The Church also established rules about who could marry whom, creating complex prohibitions based on consanguinity, affinity, and spiritual relationships. For example, People related by blood up to the seventh degree were initially forbidden to marry, though this was later reduced to the fourth degree because the original rule was nearly impossible to follow in small medieval communities where most people were distantly related. There were also restrictions during certain times of the year when marriages couldn't be celebrated, including Advent, Lent, and various other holy periods, which actually eliminated many weeks from the marriage calendar. The Church required marriages to be public, performed before witnesses, to prevent secret marriages that could lead to disputes. The requirement for publication of bans, which meant announcing an upcoming marriage in church on 3 successive Sundays or holy days, allowed anyone who knew of an impediment to the marriage to come forward and object. The development of canon law regarding marriage was a gradual process that took centuries to complete. Early medieval marriage practices varied widely across Europe, with different regions maintaining different traditions inherited from Roman law, Germanic customs, Celtic practices, or other sources. The Church worked systematically to bring these diverse practices under a unified legal framework. Church councils issued decrees about marriage. Theologians wrote treatises debating fine points of marriage law, and church courts developed precedents through handling individual cases. One of the most important developments was the increasing emphasis on consent as the essential element of marriage. Earlier medieval practice had sometimes treated marriage more as a transfer of a woman from her father's authority to her husband's authority, with the woman herself having little say. The Church's insistence that both parties must freely consent was progressive for its time, though, as mentioned, social realities often complicated this principle. Another important development was the sacramentalization of marriage, which elevated marriage from a civil contract to a holy rite. This had profound implications. It meant that the Church, not secular authorities, had primary jurisdiction over marriage. It meant that marriage was governed by divine law, not just human law. And it meant that marriage had spiritual significance beyond its practical functions. The creation of church courts to handle marriage cases was another crucial development. These courts heard cases about disputed marriages, requests for annulments, accusations of bigamy, and conflicts about dowries and other marriage-related property. Church courts used different procedures and standards of evidence than secular courts, and their decisions could have major implications for the parties involved. The role of consent in medieval marriage is particularly fascinating because it represents an intersection between progressive church doctrine and restrictive social reality. Church law insisted that both the man and woman must freely consent to marriage for it to be valid, and no amount of parental pressure, financial incentive, or social advantage could make a marriage legitimate if either party was forced. This principle was quite advanced for its time and gave individuals, particularly women, a theoretical power to refuse unwanted marriages. Historical records contain numerous cases of women brought before church courts claiming they had been forced into marriage, and sometimes these cases resulted in annulments. However, the reality was often more complicated than the theory. Social, economic, and family pressure could be overwhelming, especially for young women who had few alternatives to marriage and whose families' fortunes might depend on advantageous matches. Young people were raised in a culture that emphasized duty to family and obedience to parents, making it psychologically difficult to refuse a match their parents supported. Additionally, the definition of consent was sometimes interpreted broadly. A woman who went through a marriage ceremony without explicitly objecting might be considered to have consented, even if she had been threatened or coerced in private. Despite these limitations, the Church's insistence on consent did provide some protection and gave individuals a legal framework through which to challenge unwanted marriages, which was more than most other cultures of the time offered. The question of age of consent for marriage was another area where church law attempted to establish clear principles. Canon law eventually established that boys could consent to marriage at age 14 and girls at age 12. These ages seem shockingly young by modern standards, but they were based on medieval understanding of when puberty typically occurred and when young people were considered capable of the sexual relationship that marriage entailed. The Church considered marriages contracted by younger children to be provisional. They could be ratified when the parties reached the age of consent, or they could be dissolved if either party objected at that time. This provision was meant to protect children from being permanently bound by marriages arranged when they were too young to consent meaningfully. In practice, as discussed earlier, most common people married considerably older than these minimum ages because they needed to establish themselves economically before marriage was practical. The minimum ages were more relevant for nobility, where child betrothals and marriages served political purposes. Even among nobility, however, marriages involving very young children were relatively uncommon, and when they did occur, consummation was typically delayed until the girl was older. The Church's establishment of minimum marriage ages represented an attempt to balance several concerns: protecting children from exploitation, accommodating noble families' political needs, and upholding the principle that valid marriage required the capacity for consent. The economics of medieval marriage cannot be overstated because marriage was fundamentally an economic transaction for most people. Among the nobility, marriages involved substantial property transfers, political alliances, and complex financial arrangements. The dowry system was central to these transactions. A dowry was property or money that a bride's family gave to the groom or to the couple at marriage. For wealthy families, dowries could include land, castles, gold, jewelry, livestock, and even political rights or titles. The size of the dowry often determined the quality of match a family could secure for their daughter. Families would begin accumulating dowry assets for daughters from birth, and having multiple daughters could strain even wealthy families. In return for the dowry, the groom's family might provide a dower, which was a portion of the groom's property that would support the bride if she became a widowed. This dower was the widow's security, giving her a means of support for the rest of her life. For common people, the economics were simpler but no less important. A peasant bride might bring household goods, linens, cooking implements, livestock, or a small amount of money to the marriage. The groom would typically need to demonstrate he could support a family, perhaps by owning or renting land, having a trade, or possessing the tools necessary for his work. Marriage represented the combination of two households' resources and labor, creating an economic unit more viable than either individual could manage alone. Widows and widowers who remarried brought their accumulated property to new marriages, sometimes making them attractive marriage partners despite older age. The negotiation of dowries and marriage settlements among the nobility could be extraordinarily complex, involving lawyers, diplomats, and extended negotiations that might last months or years. These negotiations covered not just the immediate transfer of property at marriage, but also provisions for the couple's future, arrangements for potential children, and contingencies for various scenarios such as the death of one spouse or the marriage producing no heirs. Documents recording these settlements could run to many pages and include detailed inventories of property, specifications about which estates would go to which children, arrangements for widows' support, and countless other provisions. The stakes were high because vast fortunes and political power could hinge on these arrangements. Disputes about marriage settlements could lead to lawsuits that dragged on for years or even generations. Kings sometimes intervened in marriage negotiations between their nobles, either to prevent alliances they considered threatening or to encourage marriages that supported royal policy. The economics of noble marriage meant that young nobles were valuable commodities whose marriages could be bought, sold, or traded. If a noble died, leaving young children, the guardianship of those children was valuable specifically because the guardian controlled the right to arrange the children's marriages. Kings granted these guardianships as rewards to loyal supporters or sold them to raise revenue, and guardians could profit by arranging marriages that benefited themselves. For merchant and artisan families, marriage economics took on somewhat different characteristics than for either nobles or peasants. Merchants accumulated wealth through trade rather than land, and their dowries might consist of money, trade goods, business connections, or shares in commercial ventures rather than estates. A successful merchant might marry his daughter to a younger merchant or to the son of another merchant family, creating business alliances and expanding commercial networks. Craftsmen often sought to marry within their trade, with masters marrying their daughters to promising apprentices or journeymen, ensuring that skills and businesses stayed within the craft community. The widow of a master craftsman might be allowed to continue operating his workshop and might remarry another craftsman, bringing the workshop to the new marriage. Guild regulations sometimes governed these arrangements, specifying what happened to a workshop when a master died and what rights his widow had. The growing importance of monetary wealth in the later medieval period, as opposed to land-based wealth, created new opportunities for social mobility through marriage. A merchant who became wealthy could sometimes arrange marriages with minor nobility, exchanging money for status. This trend alarmed some conservative nobles who saw it as corruption of proper social hierarchies, but economic realities meant that cash-poor nobles sometimes found marriages with wealthy merchants' children attractive despite the social concerns. The wedding ceremony itself varied enormously depending on social class, region, time period, and local custom. But certain elements became increasingly standardized as the Church consolidated its authority over marriage. In the early medieval period, marriages often took place at the church door rather than inside the church building. This practice emphasized the public nature of marriage, as the community could witness the ceremony. The couple would exchange vows at the church door, with the priest presiding, and then the party would enter the church for a nuptial mass. The vows were relatively simple compared to modern, elaborate ceremonies. The groom would typically promise to take the woman as his wife and to endow her with his worldly goods, while the bride would promise to take him as her husband and to obey him. The exchange of rings became customary, with the ring placed on the bride's left hand's fourth finger, believed to contain a vein that ran directly to the heart. After the vows, the priest would bless the union, and the couple would enter the church for Mass. The ceremony was conducted in Latin, which most common people didn't understand, but the ritual's solemnity and the community's presence gave it weight and meaning. For nobility, wedding ceremonies could be elaborate affairs attended by hundreds of guests, with the church decorated with banners, flowers, and expensive fabrics. Musicians might play, and the ceremony would be followed by feasting that could last for days. For peasants, the ceremony was simpler but still significant, with the local community gathering to witness and celebrate. The liturgy of the nuptial mass included specific prayers and blessings for the married couple. The priest would pray for God's blessing on the union, for the couple's fertility, for their faithfulness to each other, and for their prosperity and happiness. Biblical readings might include passages about marriage from Genesis, describing the creation of Eve as a companion for Adam, or from the letters of Paul, discussing the relationship between husband and wife as reflecting Christ's relationship with the church. The couple might make offerings at the altar, symbolizing their dedication to building a Christian household. In some regions and periods, specific rituals were incorporated into the wedding mass. The couple might be covered with a special veil or cloth during certain prayers, symbolizing God's protection. They might share blessed bread or wine, symbolizing their union and shared life. The joining of hands, which we still see in modern weddings, was already an important element of medieval ceremonies, symbolizing the joining of the couple. After the Mass concluded, the newly married couple would process out of the church, often followed by the entire community. This procession might be boisterous and joyful, with music, singing, and celebration. The community's participation in accompanying the couple from the church to wherever the wedding feast would be held reinforced the public and communal nature of the marriage. Wedding attire in medieval times reflected social status more than anything else. The modern tradition of brides wearing white dresses only became standard in the 19th century after Queen Victoria's wedding. In medieval times, brides wore their best dress, which was typically in rich colors like red, blue, green, or gold, depending on what they could afford. Red was particularly popular because it symbolized joy and fertility. Wealthy brides wore elaborate gowns made of expensive fabrics like silk, velvet, or fine wool, often adorned with embroidery, jewels, and fur trim. The style followed contemporary fashion, with tight bodices, long sleeves, and flowing skirts. Brides often wore their hair loose and flowing, which was significant because married women typically covered their hair or wore it bound up. A crown or wreath of flowers might adorn the bride's head, symbolizing her virginity. The groom also wore his finest clothes, and for nobility, this meant expensive fabrics, elaborate embroidery, and jewelry. Nobles might wear their family colors or heraldic symbols. For common people, wedding clothes were still their best garments, but made of simpler materials like wool or linen. A peasant bride might wear a dress she had sewn herself, perhaps in a bright color that she could continue wearing for special occasions after the wedding. Both bride and groom might receive new clothes as wedding gifts from family members. The clothing's importance lay not in following specific wedding traditions, but in demonstrating to the community that this was a significant, celebrated event, and in displaying the family's social standing and prosperity as much as possible. The preparation of wedding attire could be a lengthy process, particularly for wealthy families. Noble brides might have dresses specially made by skilled seamstresses, with fabrics imported from distant lands and decorations that took months to complete. Embroidery might feature the bride's family coat of arms, or symbolic designs representing fertility, prosperity, or virtue. The bride's jewelry for the wedding might include family heirlooms passed down through generations, carrying both monetary value and sentimental significance. Pearls were particularly prized for bridal jewelry, symbolizing purity. Gold work might include intricate designs of flowers, leaves, or religious symbols. For the groom, fine tailoring that displayed his physique, rich fabrics that showed his wealth, and accessories like jeweled belts, fine gloves, or elaborate hats all contributed to his wedding appearance. Among common people, the preparation of wedding clothes was often a family project, with female relatives helping to sew the bride's dress and perhaps contributing pieces of fabric or trim from their own stores. A bride might wear a dress made from fabric that had been woven by her mother or grandmother, connecting her to previous generations. The groom might wear a new tunic made for the occasion, perhaps dyed a bright color that would mark it as special. Even if the fabrics were humble and the decorations simple, the care taken in preparing wedding clothes demonstrated the importance of the occasion and the respect the family had for the marriage ceremony. The wedding feast was arguably the most important part of medieval wedding celebrations, serving as both entertainment and a demonstration of the family's wealth and generosity. For noble families, wedding feasts were spectacular events that could last several days and host hundreds or even thousands of guests. These feasts served multiple purposes beyond celebrating the marriage. They were opportunities to display wealth and power, to strengthen political alliances, to provide entertainment, and to reinforce social hierarchies through elaborate seating arrangements and ceremonial protocols. The food served at noble wedding feasts was extraordinary by medieval standards. Multiple courses would be served, including various meats like venison, boar, swan, peacock, beef, and lamb, prepared in complex ways with expensive spices imported from the East. Fish courses were also common, particularly if the wedding occurred during a time when the church required abstinence from meat. Elaborate pies, tarts, custards, and sweet dishes would complete the meal. The food was often presented in spectacular fashion, with roasted birds sometimes redressed in their feathers, or pies containing live birds that would fly out when the crust was cut. Subtleties, which were elaborate edible sculptures made from sugar, marzipan, or pastry, might depict castles, ships, or allegorical scenes. Wine and ale flowed freely, often spiced or sweetened. Entertainment during noble wedding feasts included musicians, singers, dancers, jugglers, acrobats, and sometimes plays or pageants. For common people, the wedding feast was simpler but still important. Families would save and pool resources to provide the best food they could afford. A peasant wedding feast might include roasted meat, which was a rare luxury, along with bread, cheese, pottage, and ale. The celebration would take place in someone's home, in a barn, or outdoors in good weather, with dancing, singing, and games continuing into the night. The organization and logistics of a large, noble wedding feast were staggering. A household might begin preparations months in advance, ordering special ingredients, hiring additional cooks and servants, planning menus, and arranging for sufficient dishes, cups, and serving pieces. The feast might require specially constructed temporary structures to accommodate all the guests if existing halls were insufficient. Seating arrangements required careful attention to protocol, with the most important guests seated closest to the bride and groom on a raised dais, while less important guests were seated further away. This seating reflected and reinforced social hierarchies, and placing someone in the wrong position could cause serious offense. The serving of food followed ritualized patterns, with different dishes brought out in sequence and often announced by trumpets or other fanfare. High-ranking nobles might be served first or given choicer portions, again reflecting social status. The bride and groom might be served special dishes or portions as a sign of honor. Between courses, entertainment would be presented. A troupe of musicians might perform, jugglers might display their skills, or singers might perform songs celebrating the couple and their families. The wedding feast was theater as much as meal, a carefully orchestrated display meant to impress guests and demonstrate the host family's wealth, taste, and power. For peasant wedding feasts, the scale was much smaller, but the spirit was similar. The entire village might contribute to the feast, with neighbors bringing dishes or helping with preparations. This communal effort both eased the burden on the couple's families and reinforced community bonds. The feast might feature foods that were luxuries for peasants: white bread instead of the usual dark bread, roasted meat instead of the usual pottage with occasional bits of meat, honey-sweetened cakes, or other treats. Ale was essential at peasant wedding feasts, and often substantial quantities would be brewed specially for the occasion. The term bride ale, which eventually became bridal, originally referred to the special ale brewed for weddings. The feast would be accompanied by music provided by village musicians and dancing that might continue long into the night or even until dawn. Peasant wedding celebrations were less formal than noble feasts, but possibly more boisterous and uninhibited, with ribald songs, practical jokes, and general merriment. The community's participation in the feast served to integrate the newly married couple into their social network and to celebrate the formation of a new household that would be part of the village's economic and social fabric. Wedding gifts and their exchange formed an important part of medieval marriage customs, serving both symbolic and practical purposes. Unlike modern weddings where guests bring gifts for the couple, medieval gift-giving often flowed in multiple directions. The groom would typically give gifts to the bride, often including jewelry, which served both as adornment and as a portable form of wealth that remained the bride's personal property. The morning gift, or morgengifu, was a tradition in many medieval cultures where the groom would give the bride a gift on the morning after the wedding night, often as a reward for her virginity and as additional financial security for her future. Families would exchange gifts as part of the marriage negotiations, and these gifts could be substantial among the nobility, including land, livestock, or valuable objects. Wedding guests might bring gifts of food, household items, or money to help the new couple establish their household. In some regions, traditions like the bride ale existed, where the bride's family would brew ale and sell it to guests, with the proceeds going to the newlyweds to help them start their life together. Among nobility, the exchange of gifts served diplomatic purposes as well, with expensive gifts demonstrating wealth, forging alliances, and creating bonds of reciprocal obligation between families. The types of gifts given reflected medieval life's practical realities. Items for housekeeping, tools for work, livestock, or materials that would help the couple establish themselves economically were all common and valued. The symbolic meaning of wedding gifts extended beyond their practical utility. Gifts of jewelry from groom to bride symbolized his commitment to provide for her and also gave her portable wealth that would remain hers even if the marriage ended through his death or other causes. Rings had particular symbolic significance, with their circular shape representing eternity and unending commitment. The materials from which rings were made also carried meaning. Gold represented purity and value, while gemstones might be chosen for their supposed properties or symbolic associations. Sapphires were thought to represent faithfulness, while diamonds represented strength and endurance, though diamonds were rare in medieval times and only began to be commonly used in engagement rings much later. The exchange of gifts between families served to publicly document the marriage agreement and created witnesses to the terms of the marriage. These gifts could later be used as evidence in disputes about what had been agreed upon. Among noble families, the lavishness of gifts exchanged demonstrated not just wealth, but also the importance placed on the alliance being formed. A family that gave generous gifts showed that they valued the match and considered the alliance worth substantial investment. Reciprocally, the receiving family was placed under obligation to value the relationship and maintain the alliance. This system of gift exchange, obligation, and reciprocity was fundamental to medieval aristocratic culture and extended well beyond marriage to encompass all types of political and social relationships. The wedding night held enormous significance in medieval culture, though the reality was often less romantic than modern people might imagine. The consummation of the marriage was considered essential to completing the marriage bond, and in noble marriages, the consummation might even be witnessed to some degree, with attendants bringing the couple to the bedchamber and sometimes waiting outside to confirm that consummation had occurred. This practice seems invasive by modern standards, but it served important purposes in a society where marriage was a legal and economic contract. Proof of consummation prevented either party from later claiming the marriage was never completed and therefore invalid. The Church taught that marriage was consummated through sexual union, and an unconsummated marriage could be annulled. For political marriages between nobility, proof of consummation was sometimes essential because it confirmed that the alliance was sealed and that any future children would be legitimate heirs. The sheets might even be examined for blood as evidence of the bride's virginity, though this practice varied by region and social class. For common people, the wedding night was more private but still significant. Communities might engage in noisy celebrations outside the couple's dwelling with songs, jokes, and revelry that acknowledge the couple's new status. The emphasis on consummation reflected medieval society's practical concerns with legitimacy, inheritance, and the creation of family alliances rather than the emotional or romantic aspects of the relationship. It's worth noting that for many medieval couples, particularly among the peasantry, the wedding night might have been exhausting rather than romantic after a full day of ceremony, feasting, and celebration. The cultural attitudes toward sexuality within marriage reflected complex and sometimes contradictory teachings from the Church. On one hand, the Church taught that sexual intercourse within marriage was good and natural, ordained by God for procreation. On the other hand, the Church also taught that sexual desire itself was tainted by original sin, and that even married couples should approach sexuality with restraint and the primary intention of producing children rather than seeking pleasure. Church teaching identified specific times when married couples should abstain from sexual relations, including Sundays and holy days, during Lent and other penitential seasons, during pregnancy, and during menstruation. In practice, how closely married couples followed these detailed restrictions probably varied widely. The Church's somewhat negative view of sexuality, even within marriage, contrasted with the practical reality that successful marriages often did involve physical affection and attraction between spouses. Medieval advice literature sometimes acknowledged that married couples needed to work at maintaining harmony in all aspects of their relationship, including the physical dimension. The wedding night, as the first time the couple was alone together as husband and wife carried heavy symbolic weight as the moment when the marriage became complete and when the couple truly became one flesh, as the biblical language described it. For many couples, particularly young ones who had been carefully supervised during courtship and betrothal, the wedding night was their first experience of physical intimacy, which added to its significance and probably also to its awkwardness. Marriage among the peasantry, who made up the vast majority of medieval society, followed many of the same general patterns as noble marriages, but with significant differences in scale, formality, and economic implications. Peasant marriages were still public, religious ceremonies that required church approval, but they were simpler and more focused on the practical realities of agricultural life and survival. Peasant couples generally had somewhat more freedom in choosing their partners than nobles did, since their marriages didn't carry the same political implications, though parental approval and community acceptance remained important. Young peasants would often marry someone from their own village or a nearby settlement, someone they had known most of their lives. The timing of peasant marriages was often dictated by agricultural cycles, with weddings typically taking place after harvest, when food was plentiful and work was lighter. The betrothal period allowed the couple to accumulate what they needed to establish a household: basic furniture, cooking implements, tools, perhaps some livestock. The wedding ceremony for peasants took place at the local church, with the village community attending. The feast afterward, while modest by noble standards, represented a significant expense and was a mark of family pride and community solidarity. Neighbors and relatives would contribute food and help with preparations. After marriage, peasant couples typically lived in their own cottage, though they might initially share quarters with parents until they could establish their own household. The economic partnership aspect of marriage was perhaps most visible among peasants, where husband and wife worked side by side in the fields, in the home, and in whatever crafts or trades supplemented their farming. The wife's labor was absolutely essential to the household survival, making marriage a truly cooperative venture. The daily reality of peasant married life centered on work, survival, and mutual dependence. A peasant household functioned as an integrated economic unit with highly gendered but complementary divisions of labor. The husband typically handled the heaviest agricultural work: plowing, harvesting grain, maintaining buildings and fences, caring for larger animals like oxen or horses. The wife managed the household, which was itself a full-time job involving cooking, cleaning, making and mending clothes, caring for children, tending the kitchen garden that provided vegetables and herbs, caring for smaller animals like chickens and pigs, dairying, preserving food for winter, and countless other tasks. During harvest and other busy seasons, women worked in the fields alongside men. Both spouses might work at supplementary crafts or trades to bring in additional income. The husband might do carpentry or other skilled work during slow agricultural periods, while the wife might spin wool, weave cloth, or brew ale for sale. The success or failure of the household depended on both partners fulfilling their roles competently and working together harmoniously. A peasant whose spouse died faced serious difficulties, as replacing that partner's labor and skills was challenging. This practical interdependence meant that peasant marriages, while perhaps not based on romantic love initially, often developed into strong partnerships based on mutual respect and shared experience of facing life's hardships together. The living conditions of peasant married couples were humble by any standard. A typical peasant cottage might consist of just 1 or 2 rooms with dirt floors, simple furniture, and minimal privacy. The entire family, parents and children, might sleep in the same room, sometimes sharing beds. The lack of privacy that modern people take for granted was simply not part of peasant life. Neighbors lived in close proximity, and the small size of villages meant everyone knew everyone else's business. This lack of privacy extended to married life. Neighbors would be aware of conflicts between spouses, of whether the wife was pregnant, of economic struggles or successes. The community thus became involved in married life, sometimes offering support, but also sometimes interfering or gossiping. Despite the harshness of material conditions, peasant marriages could be warm and affectionate. Evidence from legal records, which often preserve testimony from peasants in various cases, shows peasant couples who clearly cared deeply for each other, who mourned when separated, and who worked together to protect their family's interests. The romantic ideal of courtly love might have been foreign to peasant culture, but the practical love of partners who built a life together, raised children, and supported each other through hardship was very real. The Church's influence on medieval marriage grew stronger throughout the period, with the institution gradually asserting control over marriage practices, laws, and ceremonies. Early in the medieval period, marriage was often a private arrangement between families, but by the late Middle Ages, the Church had established marriage as one of the 7 sacraments and had developed elaborate canon law governing all aspects of matrimony. The Church's involvement served multiple purposes. First, it reinforced Christian teachings about the sanctity of marriage, the importance of sexual relations only within marriage, and the permanence of the marriage bond. Second, it gave the Church authority over a fundamental social institution, increasing ecclesiastical power over secular life. Third, it provided a framework for resolving disputes about marriages, which were common and could involve significant property and inheritance issues. The church courts, rather than secular courts, had jurisdiction over marriage cases, including disputes about whether a valid marriage existed, cases of bigamy, annulment requests, and cases involving violations of marriage law, such as adultery. The Church taught that marriage had 3 goods or purposes: procreation, fidelity, and sacrament. Procreation was the primary purpose. Marriage existed to create children who would be raised in the Christian faith. Fidelity meant that spouses owed each other exclusive sexual access, and adultery was a serious offense against the marriage bond. Sacrament meant that marriage was a holy institution that reflected Christ's relationship with the Church and could not be dissolved. While the Church did allow annulments in cases where it could be proven that no valid marriage had existed in the first place, it did not permit divorce in the modern sense of ending a valid marriage. The theological development of marriage as a sacrament represented a major shift in how Christian society understood matrimony. In the early Church, marriage had been seen as a legitimate state for Christians, but not necessarily as a sacred rite comparable to baptism or communion. Over the medieval centuries, theologians gradually developed the argument that marriage was indeed a sacrament instituted by Christ, pointing to his presence at the wedding at Cana and to his teachings about marriage. The sacramental nature of marriage meant that it conferred grace on the couple, helping them to live faithfully and fulfill their duties. It also meant that the marriage bond itself had a sacred character that made it indissoluble. This theological development had profound practical implications. It meant that marriage wasn't just a civil contract that could be dissolved by mutual agreement or for cause. It was a permanent spiritual bond that only death could end. The sacramental theology of marriage also elevated the status of married life, countering earlier Christian tendencies to view celibacy as inherently more spiritual than married life. While the Church still considered consecrated celibacy to be a higher calling, it affirmed that marriage was a holy state and that married people could achieve salvation through faithful living within their marriage. Annulments were the medieval equivalent of ending a marriage, though they were legally quite different from modern divorce. An annulment was a declaration that a valid marriage had never existed, rather than a termination of an existing marriage. The Church had strict rules about what constituted grounds for annulment, and obtaining one could be complex, expensive, and time-consuming. Common grounds for annulment included consanguinity, meaning the couple was too closely related by blood, which was often used by nobles seeking to end inconvenient marriages, since the complex rules about blood relationships meant that if you looked hard enough, you could often find some distant relationship that technically prohibited the marriage. Another ground for annulment was affinity, meaning one person had previous sexual relations with a relative of their spouse, or that they were related through godparent relationships established at baptism. Lack of consent was another valid ground. If either party had been forced into the marriage or was too young to consent properly, the marriage could be annulled. Impotence or inability to consummate the marriage was also grounds for annulment, though this often required embarrassing investigations and sometimes even physical examinations. Prior contracts, meaning one party had already been betrothed or married to someone else, could invalidate a marriage. For common people, annulments were rare because they required appealing to church courts, which meant travel, legal representation, and expenses that most peasants couldn't afford. For nobility, annulments were more common, but still difficult to obtain, requiring political influence, substantial legal arguments, and often payments to the church. Famous historical examples include King Henry VIII of England's multiple attempts to obtain annulments, which eventually led to the English Reformation when the Pope refused to grant an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The process of obtaining an annulment involved presenting a case before a church court, providing evidence and witnesses to support the claim that no valid marriage had existed. Canon lawyers specialized in arguing these cases, and they developed sophisticated legal arguments based on the complex provisions of church law. Witnesses might testify about the circumstances of the marriage ceremony, about relationships between the parties that would constitute impediments, or about other facts relevant to the case. If the couple claiming an annulment had children, the church would need to rule on the status of those children. Were they legitimate if the marriage was declared invalid? Church law provided that children born of a putative marriage, meaning a marriage that both parties believed to be valid at the time, even if it was later shown to be invalid, were still considered legitimate. This provision protected children from suffering due to their parents' marriage being annulled. The other spouse could contest an annulment petition, leading to extended legal proceedings that might involve appeals to higher church courts or even to Rome. The expense, complexity, and uncertainty of annulment proceedings meant that many people trapped in unhappy marriages simply lived with them, while others separated informally without obtaining the church's approval. Women's roles and rights within medieval marriage were complex and varied, depending on social class, region, and time period. But generally speaking, marriage fundamentally changed a woman's legal and social status. The prevailing legal doctrine in much of medieval Europe was coverture, meaning that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's. She could not own property independently, make contracts, or represent herself in court without her husband's permission. Any property she brought to the marriage typically came under her husband's control, though he was supposed to preserve it, and in many regions she would regain control of it if she became widowed. Women were expected to obey their husbands, who were considered the head of the household. The Church reinforced these hierarchies, teaching that just as Christ was head of the Church, the husband was head of the wife. However, the reality of women's lives within marriage was often more complex than these legal and religious frameworks suggest. In peasant households, women were essential economic partners whose labor and skills were critical to survival. They worked in the fields alongside their husbands, managed the household, raised children, tended gardens, cared for livestock, preserved food, spun and wove cloth, brewed ale, and sometimes worked in trades or crafts. Their contributions gave them practical influence even if they lacked formal legal rights. Among merchant and artisan classes, wives often worked in the family business and might continue operating it if widowed. In noble families, women sometimes managed vast estates when their husbands were away at war or at court, making important decisions about agriculture, tenants, and finances. Despite their subordinate legal status, medieval women found ways to exercise agency, influence their husbands, protect their interests, and create spaces for their own authority within the constraints of their society. The power dynamics within individual medieval marriages undoubtedly varied widely depending on the personalities, temperaments, and circumstances of the specific couple. While the legal and social framework placed husbands in positions of authority, the reality was that some wives were strong personalities who effectively controlled their households, while some husbands were weak or passive and allowed their wives to dominate. Medieval literature contains numerous jokes and stories about henpecked husbands or shrewish wives, suggesting that the stereotype of the dominated husband existed even in a formally patriarchal society. The proverb that "the wife is the key to the house" acknowledged women's practical power over household management. A capable, intelligent wife could exercise substantial influence over her husband through persuasion, manipulation of information, or simply by being the person he relied on for advice and support. Conversely, some husbands were controlling and even abusive, and medieval law gave women limited protection against domestic violence. The Church taught that husbands could physically discipline their wives, but should not do so excessively, a standard that obviously left much room for interpretation and gave women little practical protection. Some medieval legal systems allowed neighbors or family members to intervene if a husband's treatment of his wife exceeded community norms, but this protection was informal and inconsistent. Widowhood was a significant status in medieval society, offering women more independence than they typically had as wives, though it also brought vulnerability. A widow regained control of her dower, which was the portion of her husband's estate designated for her support, giving her economic independence. Wealthy widows could be very powerful, controlling substantial property and making their own decisions about how to manage it. They could not be forced to remarry, though many did choose to remarry for economic security, companionship, or other practical reasons. Young, wealthy widows were particularly sought after as marriage partners because they brought property and experience to a marriage. However, widowhood also brought challenges. A widow without substantial property might struggle to support herself and any dependent children. She might need to rely on her grown children, return to her birth family, or seek assistance from the church or community. In some regions and time periods, widows had the right to continue their husband's trade or business, and widow craftswomen or merchants were not uncommon in medieval towns. The Church provided some support for widows through charitable institutions, and caring for widows was considered an important Christian duty. In literature and cultural depictions, widows occupied an interesting position. They were simultaneously respected for their experience and suspected of sexual availability, since they were women without male oversight. Remarriage patterns varied, but generally speaking, younger widows were more likely to remarry than older ones, and wealthy widows were more sought after as marriage partners than poor ones. The legal rights of widows varied considerably across different regions and legal systems in medieval Europe. In some areas, widows had strong legal protections and substantial property rights. English common law, for instance, provided that a widow was entitled to a third of her husband's estate as her dower, and this right could not be taken from her by her husband's will or by his heirs. Other legal systems were less generous to widows. Some regions practiced primogeniture strictly, with all property passing to the eldest son, leaving widows dependent on their children's goodwill for support. The Church generally supported widows' rights and advocated for systems that protected widows from destitution. Church courts heard cases involving disputes over widows' rights and generally ruled in favor of widows when their legal entitlements were being denied. Widows might also receive support from craft guilds if their husbands had been guild members, with some guilds allowing widows to continue operating workshops or providing pensions to members' widows. The vulnerability of widows to exploitation by their own children seeking to claim the entire estate, by opportunistic men seeking to marry them for their property, or by unscrupulous creditors or business partners, meant that legal protections for widows were an important concern throughout the medieval period. Child marriages, while disturbing to modern sensibilities, were not uncommon among medieval nobility, particularly for girls. These were arranged marriages where one or both parties were children, sometimes very young children. It's crucial to understand that while the marriage ceremony might occur when the children were young, consummation was typically not expected until both parties reached puberty, which was defined by the Church as 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These marriages served political and economic purposes, securing alliances while the children were young and ensuring that property would pass as intended. Sometimes, child marriages occurred to prevent a ward's marriage rights from being exploited by others. If a noble died leaving young children, the guardian of those children had the valuable right to arrange their marriages, and sometimes guardians would marry child wards to their own children to keep control of property within their family. Historical records contain examples of girls as young as 7 or 8 going through marriage ceremonies, though, again, these marriages weren't supposed to be consummated until the girl reached 12. Child marriages could be dissolved when the children reached the age of consent if either party objected, though this rarely happened in practice because by then the families had invested in the alliance. The Church was somewhat ambivalent about child marriages. While canon law technically required both parties to consent and young children couldn't truly consent, the Church often accommodated noble families who sought these arrangements for political reasons. Among common people, child marriages were essentially non-existent, since there was no advantage to marrying off children who couldn't yet contribute labor to a household. The experience of children in these arranged marriages varied widely. Some children were raised together, growing up as companions and perhaps developing genuine affection before they reached adulthood and their marriage was consummated. Others barely knew each other before they were expected to become true spouses. The emotional and psychological impact on children, particularly girls, married at very young ages, must have been significant, though medieval sources rarely discuss this aspect. These children had to navigate the transition from childhood to adult married life at ages when modern Western culture still considers people children in need of protection and guidance. The practice of child marriage among nobility highlights the extent to which noble children were viewed as assets to be deployed for family advantage rather than as individuals with their own needs and rights. It also demonstrates the enormous gap between noble and common experience in medieval society. While noble children might be married at 8 or 10, peasant children of the same age were playing, learning trades, and helping with household work, with marriage not even on the horizon until they reached their 20s. Royal and noble weddings deserve special attention because they were spectacular events with implications that extended far beyond the couple involved. These marriages were affairs of state, carefully negotiated through diplomatic channels, sometimes over years. The bride and groom often came from different countries and might not even speak the same language when they first met. Royal weddings served to end wars, create alliances, expand territories, and legitimize claims to thrones. The wedding celebrations reflected the magnitude of these unions. When King Henry I of England married Matilda of Scotland in 1100, the wedding served to unite Norman and Anglo-Saxon interests in England. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Louis VII of France in 1137, she brought the vast Duchy of Aquitaine to the French crown, though she later married Henry II of England after her first marriage was annulled, taking her territories with her and creating centuries of conflict between England and France. Royal wedding ceremonies were conducted by the highest-ranking religious officials available. Archbishops, bishops, or even the Pope might officiate. The ceremonies took place in the most important cathedrals or churches, decorated elaborately for the occasion. Thousands of guests might attend, representing noble families from across Europe. The feasts following royal weddings were legendary, with dozens of courses, rare delicacies, elaborate entertainments, and gifts exchanged between royal houses. Tournaments, jousts, dancing, theatrical performances, and other entertainments could continue for weeks. The costs were staggering, sometimes straining even royal treasuries, but the expense was justified by the political importance of displaying wealth, power, and the significance of the alliance being formed. The diplomatic negotiations leading up to royal marriages could be as complex as treaties ending wars. Indeed, they often were part of such treaties. Ambassadors would travel between courts, carrying proposals and counter-proposals, negotiating terms about dowries, dower rights, the status of any children, provisions for what would happen if the marriage failed to produce heirs, and countless other details. These negotiations might take months or years, with deal terms changing as political circumstances shifted. Sometimes marriages that had been agreed upon were canceled because the political situation changed before the wedding could occur. The bride in a royal marriage was often a pawn with little say in her fate, sent to a foreign land to marry a man she had never met, expected to serve her birth family's interests while also adapting to her new country and husband. Some royal brides managed this transition successfully, becoming beloved queens who served as effective bridges between their birth and adopted countries. Others struggled with homesickness, cultural differences, and the pressure of their position. The young bride might be accompanied by an entourage from her homeland, which could help ease the transition, but could also create tensions if the foreign attendants were resented by locals. Royal brides were expected to produce heirs quickly, adding another layer of pressure to their already difficult situation. The public nature of medieval weddings was essential to their validity and to their function within medieval society. Marriages needed to be public so the community could witness the union, ensuring that both parties consented, that there were no legal impediments, and that the marriage was legitimate. This public quality helped prevent secret marriages, bigamy, and disputes about whether a marriage had actually occurred. The requirement for witnesses was taken seriously. Typically, at least 2 witnesses were required for a valid marriage, though in practice, entire communities often attended weddings. The publication of bans served a similar purpose, giving anyone who knew of a reason the couple shouldn't marry, perhaps they were already married to others or were too closely related, an opportunity to object before the marriage occurred. The public quality also served social purposes. Weddings were community events that brought people together, reinforced social bonds, and marked important transitions. They were occasions for celebration, feasting, and entertainment in societies where such opportunities were limited. The public procession of the bride and groom to the church, the ceremony at the church door visible to all, and the feast with the community participating all reinforced the marriage's legitimacy and integrated the new couple into the community as a married pair. The community's involvement didn't end with the wedding. Neighbors would continue to monitor the couple's behavior, intervening if the husband abused his wife excessively, if the wife was unfaithful, or if either spouse failed in their marital duties. This community oversight could be oppressive, but it also provided some protection and support for married couples. The community's role in supervising marriages extended throughout married life. In small villages where everyone knew everyone else, it was impossible to hide marital problems. Neighbors would be aware of conflicts, of suspected infidelity, of financial difficulties, of any irregularities in the household. This information would be discussed, gossiped about, and eventually acted upon if the community felt intervention was necessary. If a husband was beating his wife too severely, meaning beyond what the community considered acceptable discipline, neighbors might intervene, with men talking to the husband or even physically stopping him if necessary. If a wife was suspected of adultery, community women might ostracize her, or the community might formally report her to church or secular authorities. If a couple was failing to fulfill their duties, perhaps not attending church, or living in obvious sin, or failing to properly care for their children, the community would notice and respond. This level of community involvement in private life seems intrusive by modern standards, but in medieval society, the household was not considered purely private. Marriage created not just a union between 2 individuals, but a household that was part of the community's social and economic fabric, and the community, therefore, had a legitimate interest in ensuring that households functioned properly. Marriage ages in medieval times varied significantly by social class and region, and popular misconceptions about medieval marriage ages persist. While it's true that noble girls might be betrothed as children and occasionally married in their early teens, particularly in politically important marriages, common people typically married much later. For peasants and townspeople, marriage usually occurred in the 20s, often mid-20s for women and late 20s for men. These later marriage ages were driven by practical considerations. Men needed to establish themselves economically before they could support a family, whether by inheriting or obtaining land, completing apprenticeships in trades, or otherwise securing their livelihood. Women needed to accumulate dowry goods and also might work for wages before marriage. Additionally, delayed marriage served as a form of population control, preventing unsustainable population growth. Studies of medieval records from various regions show that average age at first marriage for women ranged from the late teens to mid-20s, while men typically married in their mid to late 20s. These averages mask considerable variation. In some regions and times, people married younger, while in others they married older. Noble women did tend to marry younger than peasant women, with marriages in the mid to late teens being common among the nobility, though marriages of very young girls were exceptional rather than typical. Life expectancy affects how we should interpret these ages. People didn't typically live past 40 or 50 in medieval times, so marriage in the 20s represented a different life stage than it does today, when people often live into their 80s or beyond. The factors influencing marriage age were complex and interconnected. Economic considerations were paramount for most people. A young man couldn't marry until he had the means to support a household, which might mean waiting to inherit land from his father, accumulating enough money to rent land or establish himself in a trade, or completing the years of apprenticeship required to become a master craftsman. For younger sons who wouldn't inherit the family land, prospects for marriage might be delayed even further or might never materialize if they couldn't establish themselves economically. Young women needed dowries, and families needed time to accumulate the goods, money, or property that would constitute the dowry. A family with multiple daughters might need to marry them off sequentially, with younger daughters waiting while older sisters married first. The availability of housing also affected marriage age. A couple needed somewhere to live, and in some regions, housing was scarce. Some couples might wait to marry until the husband's parents died and they could inherit the family cottage, or until they could afford to build or rent their own dwelling. Demographic factors also played a role. In times and places where population was low relative to available land and resources, people might marry younger because establishing new households was easier. In times and places where population pressure was high, marriage ages tended to increase as young people had to wait longer to secure the resources necessary for marriage. Interfaith and interethnic marriages were generally problematic in medieval Europe, as the Church strongly discouraged or forbade marriage between Christians and non-Christians. Marriage to Jews, Muslims, or pagans was prohibited under canon law, and such marriages could result in severe penalties, including excommunication. This prohibition reflected the Church's understanding of marriage as a Christian sacrament that couldn't be validly contracted with non-Christians. It also reflected and reinforced medieval society's religious divisions and prejudices. In regions where Christians lived alongside Jewish or Muslim communities, such as medieval Spain or Sicily, interactions occurred, and occasionally romantic relationships developed between people of different faiths, but formal marriage was prohibited. If such marriages occurred, one party would typically need to convert to the other's religion. Conversion could be genuine, or could be a formality to allow the marriage to proceed. The Church was deeply suspicious of converts, particularly converts from Judaism, worrying that they might secretly maintain their previous religious practices. Children from interfaith relationships faced questions about their legitimacy and religious identity. In some cases, particularly in frontier regions or during the Crusades, we have records of Christian men taking Muslim wives or vice versa, but these unions existed outside the normal legal and religious framework of marriage. Inter-ethnic marriages between Christians of different ethnic backgrounds were more acceptable, though still sometimes controversial. Norman nobles marrying Anglo-Saxon women after the Norman conquest of England, or French nobility marrying German nobility, might face cultural differences and language barriers, but these marriages were legally valid and religiously acceptable. The key factor was religion, not ethnicity. The treatment of converts to Christianity in the context of marriage reveals much about medieval attitudes toward religious identity. In medieval understanding, religion wasn't simply a matter of personal belief, it was tied to identity, community, and culture. Someone who converted from Judaism or Islam to Christianity was viewed with suspicion as their sincerity was questioned. Would they truly abandon their former faith, or would they practice Christianity publicly while maintaining Jewish or Muslim beliefs privately? This suspicion was particularly strong in regions like Spain, where there were significant populations of converts. The Spanish Inquisition, established in the late medieval period, focused particularly on investigating converted Jews to determine if they were secretly practicing Judaism. For Muslims who converted to marry Christians, or Christians who converted to marry Muslims, their conversions were often viewed as merely expedient rather than genuine. The children of such marriages might face questions about their religious identity and whether they were truly part of the Christian community. These attitudes created significant barriers to interfaith marriage beyond the simple legal prohibition, as even if conversion occurred to make a marriage legally possible, social acceptance of the couple and their children might be limited. Second marriages and remarriage were common in medieval society, though they were viewed somewhat differently from first marriages. Given the high mortality rate from disease, childbirth complications, and other causes, many people lost spouses and remarried, sometimes multiple times over their lives. The Church permitted remarriage after a spouse's death, though it considered first marriages slightly more spiritually elevated than subsequent ones. Some early church fathers had expressed the view that remaining unmarried after being widowed was more virtuous, but the church ultimately accepted that remarriage was often necessary and beneficial. For widows and widowers with children, remarriage provided a new parent for the children and additional economic support. For younger widowed people, remarriage offered the opportunity to have more children. Remarriage created complex family structures with stepchildren, half-siblings, and complicated inheritance issues. Marriage contracts for second marriages often carefully specified what property would go to children from previous marriages versus children from the new marriage. Widows who controlled property had significant power in negotiating terms for remarriage, sometimes including provisions that protected their independence and their children's inheritances. Remarriage usually occurred fairly quickly after a spouse's death, particularly for people of means who needed to maintain households and manage property. A wealthy widow might remarry within months, while a widower with young children might seek a new wife with similar haste to provide care for the children. The wedding ceremonies for second marriages were typically simpler and less elaborate than first weddings, reflecting the couple's maturity and experience and the fact that they were already established in the community. The social attitudes toward remarriage revealed interesting aspects of medieval mentality. While remarriage was accepted as practical and necessary, there was sometimes social commentary or humor directed at widows or widowers who remarried, particularly if they remarried quickly or if there was a significant age difference between the partners. Young widows who remarried older, wealthy men might face suggestions that they were motivated purely by money. Older widowers who married young women might be mocked as foolish or lecherous. The Church's slight preference for widows and widowers to remain unmarried, while not enforced, did create a sense that remarriage was a lesser state than maintaining widowhood. Despite these undercurrents, remarriage was extremely common, and most widowed people who were young enough and had adequate resources did remarry. The practicalities of medieval life made it difficult for most people to remain unmarried. Households needed both male and female labor, children needed care, and the economic partnership of marriage was valuable. For noble widows, remarriage could be politically important, and kings sometimes arranged remarriages for wealthy widows to reward loyal supporters or create alliances. Some widows resisted pressure to remarry, particularly wealthy widows who valued their independence, and church law supported their right to refuse remarriage. The trousseau and household establishment were important aspects of medieval marriage preparation, particularly for the bride. A trousseau consisted of clothing, linens, and personal items that a bride brought to her marriage. Creating a trousseau was often a years-long project, with mothers, daughters, and sometimes other female relatives working together to sew, embroider, and accumulate the items a young woman would need in her married life. For wealthy families, the trousseau could be extensive and luxurious, including elaborate gowns, fine linens decorated with embroidery, expensive fabrics, jewelry, and personal items. For common families, the trousseau was simpler but still represented significant work and investment. Homespun cloth sewn into practical garments, linens for the bed and table, and basic necessities. The trousseau remained the wife's personal property even after marriage, and she might add to it throughout her life or pass items down to her daughters. Establishing the household involved both families contributing items necessary for the couple to begin housekeeping. Furniture, cooking implements, dishes, agricultural tools, livestock, seed for planting, and innumerable other items were needed to establish a functioning household. For peasants, this might mean simple wooden furniture, basic cooking pots, tools for field work, perhaps a few chickens or a pig. For noble families, establishing a household meant furnishing entire manors or castles with appropriate furniture, tapestries, plate, servants, and all the accoutrements of noble life. The establishment of the household was one of the main economic functions of marriage, and one reason why young people needed to accumulate resources before they could marry. The process of accumulating household goods and establishing a new household was a major undertaking that required planning, work, and the cooperation of both families. Young women might begin working on their trousseaux in their teens, spinning and weaving cloth, sewing garments and linens, and embroidering decorative elements. This work served both practical and symbolic purposes. It demonstrated the young woman's skills and industriousness, prepared her for married life, and created the actual goods she would need. Mothers taught daughters these skills and worked alongside them, creating an opportunity for bonding and for passing down techniques and knowledge. Young men worked to accumulate the tools, livestock, or other resources they would need. A carpenter might make furniture for his future household. A farmer might work to save money to buy livestock or to rent land. The cooperation of extended family was often essential. Parents might give substantial gifts to help their children establish households, while other relatives might contribute smaller items. In some cases, communities had customs of collective support for new couples. Neighbors might help build or repair a cottage for newlyweds, or might contribute food or other necessities. This communal support reflected the medieval understanding that a new marriage and household affected the entire community, which therefore had an interest in helping the new couple succeed. The establishment of a new household was a rite of passage, marking the couple's transition to full adult status in the community. Clandestine marriages were a persistent problem in medieval society and a source of great frustration for church authorities. A clandestine marriage was one contracted secretly, without witnesses or public announcement, contrary to church law. The problem was that under church doctrine, what made a marriage valid was the free exchange of consent between the two parties. If a man and woman privately promised to marry each other using the correct words, particularly using present tense vows like, "I take you as my spouse," they were considered married in the eyes of God, even without a ceremony, witnesses, or church blessing. This created obvious problems. Secret marriages could be used to circumvent parental authority, particularly when young people of different social classes or from families with feuds wished to marry. They could be used for deception. A man might seduce a woman by promising marriage, then deny the marriage had occurred. They made it possible for people to contract multiple marriages, since without public record-keeping, it was difficult to prove whether someone was already married. The Church tried various approaches to prevent clandestine marriages. The requirement to publish bans was one attempt. By announcing upcoming marriages publicly 3 times, anyone who knew of an impediment could object. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 established that marriages should be celebrated publicly at the church door with a priest present. However, the Church maintained that even clandestine marriages were valid if the proper words of consent were exchanged, though couples who married clandestinely could be punished with penance. This created a contradiction. The marriage was valid, but the couple had sinned by contracting it improperly. The Church couldn't invalidate these marriages without undermining its own theology that consent made marriage. Court records from throughout the medieval period contain numerous cases of disputed marriages, with one party claiming a marriage had occurred through a private exchange of vows while the other party denied it. These cases often came down to the credibility of witnesses who might have overheard the vows or been told about them. The problem of clandestine marriage wasn't fully resolved until the Council of Trent in the 16th century finally declared that marriages contracted without a priest and witnesses were invalid, not just improper. The social damage caused by clandestine marriages extended beyond the immediate parties. When disputes arose about whether a clandestine marriage had occurred, families could be drawn into bitter conflicts, reputations could be destroyed, property rights became uncertain, and the status of any children born to the disputed union was questioned. Young women who claimed to have contracted clandestine marriages faced particular difficulties. If they couldn't prove the marriage, they might be left pregnant and unmarried, ruining their reputations and prospects. Some men deliberately exploited the system, promising marriage to seduce women and then denying the promises afterward. The church courts heard many sad cases of women claiming men had promised to marry them, sometimes with witnesses to support their claims and sometimes without. The outcomes of these cases varied depending on the evidence, the credibility of the parties, and sometimes the social status of those involved. A noble woman claiming a clandestine marriage to a nobleman of equal rank might be taken more seriously than a peasant girl claiming a similar marriage. The vulnerability of women to deception through false marriage promises was recognized as a serious problem. Yet the Church's theological position that consent alone made marriage valid prevented easy solutions. The tension between protecting the principle of consent and preventing abuse of that principle was never fully resolved in the medieval period. Wedding music and entertainment played an important role in medieval wedding celebrations, varying greatly by social class and region. Among the nobility, professional musicians were hired to perform at wedding feasts and celebrations. These might include minstrels who sang and played instruments, instrumentalists who performed on lutes, harps, viols, shawms, trumpets, and drums, and sometimes entire musical ensembles. The music served multiple purposes. It enhanced the festive atmosphere, demonstrated the host's wealth and sophistication, and provided entertainment for guests. Songs performed at weddings might include love songs, ballads, religious hymns appropriate to the occasion, and sometimes humorous or bawdy songs. Dancing was an important part of noble wedding celebrations, with elaborate dances that reflected courtly culture and provided opportunities for social interaction. For common people, wedding music was simpler, but no less important to the celebration. Village musicians, perhaps someone who played the pipe and tabor or a fiddle, would provide music for dancing. Folk songs traditional to the region would be sung, and dancing would continue late into the night. These dances were communal, often involving circles or lines of dancers, and everyone participated regardless of age. The music and dancing helped create the celebratory atmosphere and allowed the community to participate actively in honoring the couple. In some regions, traditional wedding songs existed that were sung only at weddings, passed down through generations. Other entertainment at weddings might include storytelling, games, juggling, and various forms of merriment that brought joy to the occasion. The specific types of dances performed at medieval weddings varied by region and social class. Noble weddings might feature courtly dances like the carole, a circle dance, or the estampi, a more elaborate dance with specific steps and patterns. These dances had rules about who could dance with whom, and required participants to know the steps, making them markers of social status and courtly education. The nobility valued dancing as an accomplishment, and young nobles were taught to dance as part of their education. At peasant weddings, the dancing was less formal and more energetic. Round dances where participants held hands in a circle were common, as were line dances where dancers formed rows. Some dances involved specific movements or gestures that might have symbolic meanings related to fertility or courtship. Dancing at peasant weddings could become quite boisterous, particularly as the evening wore on and more ale was consumed. The Church had somewhat ambivalent attitudes toward dancing. It recognized dancing as a natural expression of joy, but worried about the potential for immodest behavior or excessive frivolity. Church authorities sometimes tried to regulate dancing, particularly dancing in churchyards or on holy days, but dancing remained a beloved part of wedding celebrations throughout the medieval period. The marriage bed and bedding ceremony were significant elements of medieval weddings, particularly among the nobility. The marriage bed itself was often an important piece of furniture, and for wealthy couples, it might be elaborately carved and hung with expensive curtains and bedding. The bed represented the private space where the couple would consummate their marriage, and, hopefully, conceive children to continue the family line. The bedding ceremony was a ritual in which the wedding guests would escort the bride and groom to their bedchamber. Among the nobility, this could be quite elaborate, with specific people having the honor of performing certain roles. Women would help the bride undress and prepare for bed, while men would assist the groom. The bride and groom would be placed in the bed together, and a priest might bless the bed and pray for the couple's fertility. After these formalities, the guests would withdraw, though in some cases attendants might wait outside the door or nearby to confirm that consummation had occurred. This practice, which seems extremely invasive by modern standards, reflected the political and legal importance of consummation in noble marriages. For royal marriages, the bedding ceremony was even more formal and public, with witnesses of high rank present to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. For common people, the bedding ceremony was usually less formal, but might still involve friends and family escorting the couple to their bed, with jokes, songs, and well wishes before leaving them to privacy. The importance placed on the wedding night and consummation reflected medieval society's concerns with legitimacy, inheritance, and the proper ordering of sexual relationships within marriage. The blessing of the marriage bed was an ancient custom that the Church Christianized and incorporated into wedding rituals. The priest would pray that the couple's union would be fruitful, that they would be protected from evil, and that their children would be healthy and virtuous. In some traditions, the bed might be sprinkled with holy water, or herbs known for their symbolic associations with fertility or protection might be placed in the bed or bedchamber. These practices blended Christian ritual with older folk beliefs about ensuring fertility and warding off harmful influences. The bed itself might be prepared with special linens, perhaps from the bride's trousseau, that had been carefully made and decorated. For wealthy couples, the bedchamber would be perfumed with expensive incenses or scented with flowers. The lighting of candles created ambiance and also had symbolic significance, as light represented the blessing of God on the union. All these preparations and rituals emphasized the significance of the wedding night as the moment when the marriage became complete and the couple truly became one flesh in the biblical sense. The elaborate attention paid to this private moment may seem contradictory, but it reflected medieval understanding that even the most intimate aspects of life had public significance when they involved matters of inheritance, legitimacy, and the continuation of families. Fertility and children were central concerns in medieval marriage, as producing heirs was considered one of marriage's primary purposes. The Church taught that procreation was the first and most important of the three goods of marriage. For nobility, producing legitimate heirs was absolutely critical. Entire kingdoms and vast estates needed heirs to continue family lines and prevent succession crises. The pressure on noble couples, particularly on wives, to produce children was intense. A noblewoman who failed to produce children, especially male heirs, might find her position precarious. Her husband might seek an annulment on grounds of sterility, and the political alliances her marriage represented might be weakened.
History is full of examples of marriages ended or strained because of fertility issues, though in medieval understanding, infertility was almost always blamed on the woman rather than recognized as something that could affect either partner.
For common people, children were also important as future laborers who would help with farm work or family trades and as caregivers for parents in old age. Medieval families tended to be large by modern standards, though high infant and child mortality meant that many children didn't survive to adulthood. Women faced the real danger of death in childbirth, which was a leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. The lack of effective contraception meant that married couples typically had children regularly throughout the wife's fertile years, though there's evidence that some forms of birth control and family limitation were practiced despite church prohibitions. Breastfeeding provided some natural spacing between children, and there may have been herbal preparations or other methods used to prevent conception, though the effectiveness of medieval contraceptive methods was limited. The medieval understanding of conception and pregnancy was based on ancient medical theories that were often inaccurate by modern standards, but that shaped how people thought about fertility and childbearing. Medieval medical theory, derived largely from ancient Greek and Roman sources, held that both men and women contributed seed to conception, though the man's seed was considered more important in determining the child's characteristics. Temperature, diet, timing, and even the position of stars were thought to affect conception and the characteristics of children conceived. Women were advised about behaviors that would promote fertility or ensure healthy pregnancies, though much of this advice was based on superstition rather than genuine medical knowledge. The sex of a child was thought to be determined by various factors, including which side of the womb the fetus implanted on, the temperature during conception, and the relative strength of the male and female seeds. Throughout pregnancy, women followed various practices meant to ensure healthy outcomes, including dietary restrictions, prayers to saints associated with childbirth, wearing amulets, and avoiding certain activities thought to be harmful. The Church taught that pregnant women should continue to attend Mass and practice their faith, though they might be exempted from fasting requirements. As childbirth approached, preparations would be made, including gathering the necessary supplies, arranging for female relatives and neighbors to assist, and sometimes making confession in case the birth proved fatal. Adultery was considered a serious offense in medieval marriage, both by the Church and by secular society, though the consequences and social attitudes differed significantly for men and women. The Church taught that marriage created an exclusive sexual relationship, and either spouse who had sexual relations with someone outside the marriage committed the serious sin of adultery. However, in practice, male adultery was often tolerated to a degree that female adultery never was. A married man who had affairs or visited prostitutes might be criticized, but his marriage would usually remain intact, and his reputation, while perhaps tarnished, wouldn't be destroyed. A married woman who committed adultery faced much more serious consequences: public humiliation, abandonment by her husband, possible violence, and complete loss of reputation. This double standard reflected medieval society's patriarchal structure and its obsession with ensuring the legitimacy of heirs. A man's adultery didn't threaten the legitimacy of his wife's children, but a woman's adultery meant any resulting children might not be her husband's, which had serious implications for inheritance. Some regions had laws allowing husbands to kill wives and their lovers if caught in adultery, though the husband might also be required to kill both or neither. He couldn't kill just one. Church courts handled adultery cases and could impose penances, and serious cases might result in excommunication. Secular authorities might also impose punishments, particularly on women, ranging from fines to public humiliation to physical punishment. Despite the severe consequences, adultery certainly occurred in medieval society at all social levels, and court records preserve many cases of disputed paternity, accusations of adultery, and the complicated aftermath of extramarital affairs. The punishments for adultery varied significantly across different regions and time periods in medieval Europe. In some areas, adulterous women might be publicly shamed through rituals like being paraded through town, being forced to wear distinctive clothing marking them as adulteresses, or being subjected to rough music or charivari, where the community gathered to make noise and mock the guilty party. In more severe cases, women might be physically punished through whipping or other corporal punishment, or might be banished from the community. Men who committed adultery faced much lighter consequences generally, though if they had relations with another man's wife, the cuckolded husband might seek revenge or compensation. The concept of honor was deeply tied to sexual behavior in medieval culture, particularly for women. A woman who committed adultery not only sinned, but also dishonored herself, her husband, and her entire family. For noble families, the stakes were even higher because adultery could threaten inheritance and succession. A queen who committed adultery could be accused of treason because her actions potentially introduced illegitimate children into the royal succession. Several medieval queens were accused of adultery, whether accurately or as part of political plots against them, and these accusations could result in execution. The most famous example is probably Anne Boleyn, executed for adultery, though her case is technically just beyond the medieval period. The role of matchmakers and marriage brokers existed in some forms in medieval society, particularly for arranging marriages between families who didn't have direct connections. For nobility, such arrangements were often handled through diplomatic channels, with ambassadors or representatives negotiating marriage terms between royal or noble houses. Go-betweens might carry messages, arrange meetings, and help negotiate the complex financial and political terms of aristocratic marriages. In Jewish communities, which existed in many parts of medieval Europe, professional matchmakers, or shadshanim, played traditional roles in arranging marriages, though Jewish marriage customs also involved strong community oversight and different religious requirements from Christian marriages. For common people, family members, particularly older women, might serve informal matchmaking roles, suggesting potential partners, making introductions, and facilitating courtship. The village priest might also play a role in suggesting suitable matches among his parishioners. In medieval towns, merchants and craftspeople often arranged marriages for their children with families in similar trades, creating business alliances as well as family bonds. These arrangements were usually handled through personal connections rather than professional matchmakers. The arranged nature of many medieval marriages didn't necessarily mean the couples were unhappy. Many arranged marriages developed into partnerships of genuine affection and mutual respect, and medieval people generally had more modest expectations about romantic love in marriage than modern Western culture promotes. The practice of arranging marriages raises questions about how medieval people understood love and compatibility in marriage. While romantic love wasn't the primary basis for most marriages, medieval people certainly recognized that some couples were more compatible than others, and that having a spouse you could get along with made life easier and happier. Parents arranging marriages for their children often did consider factors beyond just economic or political advantage. They might look for matches where the temperaments seemed compatible, where the families had similar values and status, or where there were other factors suggesting the couple might build a successful life together. The advice that parents gave to children entering arranged marriages often included counsel about how to build a good relationship with a spouse, treat each other with respect, be patient with each other's faults, work together for the household's good, and develop affection through shared experience. Medieval people understood that love could grow over time, even if it wasn't present initially, and many arranged marriages did develop into relationships of genuine care and affection. The medieval conception of marital love emphasized duty, respect, partnership, and loyalty more than romantic passion, but these qualities could create strong and lasting bonds between spouses. Divorce, as we understand it today, the legal termination of a valid marriage allowing both parties to remarry, didn't exist in medieval Christian Europe. The Church held that marriage was a sacrament that created an indissoluble bond, reflecting Christ's permanent relationship with the Church. Once a valid marriage was consummated, it could not be dissolved until death. The Church's position was based on Jesus' teachings as recorded in the Gospels, where he stated that what God has joined together, man should not separate. This prohibition against divorce was one of the distinctive features of Christian marriage law that set it apart from Jewish and Islamic marriage law, both of which permitted divorce under certain circumstances. However, while divorce wasn't possible, the Church did recognize legal separation for serious causes. A couple could be granted separation from bed and board if there were grave reasons such as adultery, cruelty, heresy, or apostasy. This separation didn't dissolve the marriage, neither party could remarry, and they remained legally married, but it allowed them to live apart and relieved them of some marital duties. Additionally, as discussed earlier, annulments could declare that a valid marriage had never existed if certain conditions were met. The prohibition on divorce had significant implications for medieval people trapped in unhappy, abusive, or dysfunctional marriages. Some couples separated informally without church approval, living apart, and perhaps even establishing new households with other partners, though such arrangements existed outside the legal framework, and any children from subsequent relationships would be illegitimate. The inability to divorce meant that for many medieval people, an unhappy marriage was a life sentence, though the Church's insistence on consent and the availability of legal separation provided some limited protections. The Church's theological reasoning for the prohibition on divorce was sophisticated and based on multiple sources of authority. Scripture provided the primary foundation, particularly Jesus' teachings about marriage in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The early church fathers had written extensively about marriage, generally taking the position that marriage was permanent. The Church developed the theology that marriage was a sacrament that conferred grace and that had been instituted by Christ himself, pointing to his presence at the wedding at Cana as evidence. The sacramental nature of marriage meant it couldn't be dissolved by human authority any more than baptism could be undone. The Church also taught that marriage symbolized the union between Christ and the Church, which was eternal and unbreakable, so marriage itself must share that quality of permanence. These theological positions were deeply held and central to church teaching, making it extremely difficult for the Church to allow divorce, even in cases where continuing the marriage seemed to cause great suffering. The contrast with other religious traditions that did allow divorce, particularly Judaism and Islam, was noted by medieval Christians and was seen as evidence of Christianity's higher moral standards and truer understanding of God's will for marriage. Regional variations in wedding customs throughout medieval Europe were substantial, reflecting different cultural traditions, legal systems, and local practices. In Scandinavia, marriage customs retained elements of older Norse traditions even after Christianization, including the importance of the bride's dowry and particular gift-giving rituals. Germanic regions had their own traditions about marriage contracts and the transfer of property.
In Spain, centuries of interaction between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures created unique marriage customs in some regions, particularly in areas that had been under Muslim rule and were reconquered by Christians.
In Italy, particularly in city-states like Florence and Venice, marriage customs reflected merchant culture and republican political structures, with elaborate marriage contracts and strong emphasis on dowries. In Celtic regions like Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, older Celtic traditions influenced Christian marriage practices, including different customs around betrothal and different legal traditions about property rights in marriage. In Eastern Europe, Orthodox Christian marriage traditions differed somewhat from Western Catholic practices, with different liturgies, different legal frameworks, and different cultural attitudes toward various aspects of marriage. Even within regions, local customs varied from town to town and village to village. Some regions had traditions of mock battles or contests between the groom's party and the bride's party before the wedding. Other regions had particular foods that were traditional for weddings, or songs that had to be sung, or rituals that had to be performed. The timing of weddings varied. In some agricultural regions, weddings clustered at particular times of year after harvests, while in other regions they were more evenly distributed. The role of different family members in the ceremony, the specific vows exchanged, the wedding procession's route, and countless other details varied by locality. Despite this variation, certain common elements united medieval Christian weddings across Europe: the requirement for consent, the public nature of the ceremony, religious blessing, and the celebration by the community. The influence of local customary law on marriage practices was significant in many regions. Customary law consisted of traditional practices and rules that had been followed for generations and that were recognized as having legal force even if they weren't written down in formal legal codes. In many parts of medieval Europe, customary law governed important aspects of marriage, including property rights, inheritance, the requirements for valid marriages, and the resolution of marriage disputes. These customary laws varied widely. Some regions practiced partible inheritance, where all children, including daughters, inherited shares of family property, while other regions practiced primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited everything. Some regions gave widows strong property rights, while others left widows largely dependent on their children's goodwill. Marriage customs were similarly varied. The specific form that marriages took, the gifts that were traditional, the way property was transferred, and many other details were governed by local custom, as much as or more than by church law or royal decree. The relationship between customary law, church law, and royal or secular law was complex and sometimes contentious. The Church worked to bring marriage practices under its authority and to replace local customs that conflicted with church teaching, but this was a gradual process that was never entirely complete during the medieval period. Many local customs persisted alongside church requirements, creating a layered system where marriages had to satisfy multiple sets of requirements to be fully valid and accepted. The legacy of medieval marriage customs extends strongly into modern times, though many people don't realize how many contemporary wedding traditions have medieval or earlier origins. The custom of engagement rings, particularly diamond engagement rings, is often thought to be very old, but actually, the diamond engagement ring is a 20th century marketing invention. However, the giving of betrothal rings has medieval and ancient roots. The tradition of the bride wearing a special dress, though not specifically white, goes back to medieval practice. The exchange of vows, the role of a religious officiant, and the public ceremony all have medieval precedents. The wedding feast and celebration with family and community continues the medieval tradition. Throwing rice or other grains at the couple has ancient fertility symbolism that continued through the medieval period. The bride being escorted to the ceremony by her father reflects medieval practice where fathers had authority over their unmarried daughters. The cutting of a wedding cake has roots in medieval bread-breaking traditions. Even the honeymoon has possible medieval origins, though the modern practice differs significantly from medieval customs. More broadly, many of our cultural assumptions about marriage, that it should be a public ceremony, that it requires consent from both parties, that it creates a new family unit, that it involves both religious and legal dimensions, were shaped during the medieval period. The Church's success in establishing marriage as a sacrament and in creating a comprehensive legal framework for marriage had lasting effects that continue to influence Western marriage law and custom even in increasingly secular societies. Understanding medieval marriage helps us understand why our own marriage customs and laws look the way they do. The evolution of marriage customs from early medieval to late medieval period shows significant changes, reflecting broader social, economic, and religious developments. In the early medieval period, particularly in the centuries immediately following the fall of Rome, marriage customs retained many elements of Germanic, Celtic, and other pre-Christian traditions, with the Christian Church having only partial control over marriage practices. Marriage was often a private arrangement between families, with the Church involved mainly to provide blessings rather than to control the process. As the medieval period progressed, the Church gradually increased its authority over marriage, culminating in marriage being declared a sacrament in the 12th century. This increasing Church control standardized many practices and created a more unified legal framework across Christian Europe. The development of church courts that handled marriage disputes gave the Church practical as well as theoretical authority over marriage. Economic changes also affected marriage customs. As the money economy developed and towns grew, marriage arrangements became somewhat more flexible, with personal wealth from trade or crafts making individuals less dependent on land-based family wealth. The rise of Romantic literature and the courtly love tradition in the High Middle Ages introduced new ideals about love and relationships, though these ideals often existed in tension with the practical realities of arranged marriages. By the late medieval period, we see early hints of the changes that would accelerate in the early modern period, slightly more emphasis on the couple's feelings toward each other, some increase in age at marriage in some regions, and the beginning of challenges to church authority that would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation and different Christian approaches to marriage. The legal status of children born outside marriage, commonly called bastards in medieval terminology, was a significant issue with serious implications for the children affected. Canon law held that children born outside valid Christian marriage were illegitimate, with limited inheritance rights and social stigma. However, church law did provide that if a couple married after having children, those children could be legitimized by the subsequent marriage of their parents. Secular law varied more by region, but generally, illegitimate children couldn't inherit titles, land, or property in the same way legitimate children could, though they might receive something at their father's discretion. This created strong incentives for people to marry before or shortly after conception. For nobility, having illegitimate children was fairly common. Noble men often fathered children with mistresses, servants, or other women, and these children might be acknowledged and supported, but couldn't inherit titles or positions in the succession unless specifically legitimized by royal decree. Famous historical examples include numerous illegitimate children of kings and nobles who played important roles in history despite their illegitimate status. For common people, children born out of wedlock faced social stigma and economic disadvantages, as they had no claim on their father's property and their mother might struggle to support them alone. In some cases, pregnancy before marriage led to hasty weddings to legitimize the child. Medieval records suggest that a fair number of first children were born quite soon after marriage, indicating that conception occurred during the betrothal period or even before. The Church tried to control sexual behavior and enforce the rule that intimacy should only occur within marriage, but human nature and the realities of courtship meant that this rule was frequently broken. The situation of unwed mothers in medieval society was particularly difficult. A woman who became pregnant outside marriage faced severe social consequences, including loss of reputation, difficulty finding a husband, and potential rejection by her family. If the father of the child refused to marry her or denied paternity, she had limited options. She might try to prove paternity in church court, but this required evidence and witnesses, and outcomes were uncertain. Some unwed mothers attempted to conceal their pregnancies and then abandoned their infants, a practice the Church condemned, but that occurred with some frequency. Others might find support from family members who helped care for the child, though this depended on family resources and willingness to weather the social stigma. In some regions, charitable institutions associated with the Church provided support for unwed mothers and their children, though resources were limited. The father of an illegitimate child had moral obligations to support the child under church teaching, and church courts might order fathers to provide support, but enforcement was difficult if the father denied paternity or simply refused to comply. The different treatment of unwed fathers versus unwed mothers reflected the broader gender inequalities of medieval society. Men who fathered children outside marriage faced relatively minor consequences, while women bore most of the social, economic, and practical burdens. The question of love in medieval marriage is complex and often misunderstood. Modern people sometimes assume medieval marriages were loveless arrangements where couples remained strangers bound by duty. The reality was more nuanced. It's certainly true that most medieval marriages, particularly among the nobility, were arranged based on practical considerations rather than romantic love. Young people often had limited say in whom they married, and they might barely know their spouses before the wedding. The concept of marrying for love, of choosing a spouse based on personal attraction and emotional connection, was not the norm in medieval society. However, this doesn't mean medieval marriages were necessarily cold or unhappy. Medieval people had different expectations about marriage than we do. They didn't expect marriage to fulfill all their emotional needs or to be primarily about romantic love. They understood marriage as a partnership for practical purposes, running a household, raising children, managing property, and fulfilling religious and social duties. Within this framework, many couples developed deep affection, respect, and emotional bonds. Letters and chronicles from the period provide evidence of married couples who clearly cared deeply for each other, grieved when separated, and mourned when one died. The Church taught that spouses should treat each other with kindness and respect, and while it emphasized duty over romance, it acknowledged that affection between spouses was good. For common people especially, spending years working side by side, facing hardships together, and raising children created strong bonds, even if the marriage hadn't begun with romantic love. Medieval people weren't emotionless or incapable of love. They simply fit love and emotion into a different social framework than we do today. Medieval literature and poetry provide fascinating windows into how people thought about love and marriage, though we must be careful about taking literary evidence as direct reflection of reality. The troubadour poetry of southern France celebrated passionate, idealized love that was often explicitly separate from marriage. The poet loved a lady, often another man's wife, from afar, and this love was meant to inspire noble deeds and beautiful poetry, rather than to lead to marriage or physical fulfillment. This literary tradition created a cultural space for discussing romantic love and its emotions, even while actual marriages were arranged on practical grounds. Other forms of medieval literature, including romances and tales, explored themes of love, desire, loyalty, and the conflicts between personal feeling and social duty. These stories resonated with audiences because they addressed real human emotions and dilemmas, even when set in fantastical or legendary contexts. The very existence of this literature demonstrates that medieval people experienced the same range of emotions about love that humans have always experienced, even if their social structures channeled those emotions differently than modern Western culture does. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.